The retirement industry has a favorite trick. It takes a number that would make most people feel relieved. Then it wraps that number in just enough fear that relief turns back into anxiety before the day is over. That is exactly what is happening when people say $1.5 million is not really a strong retirement number anymore, that it is merely a checkpoint, that it is barely enough, that it may fail you, that it is more like the floor than the finish line. I understand why this language is powerful. Fear is memorable. Fear gets clicks. Fear sounds like seriousness, but fear is not the same thing as truth. And one of the most expensive habits in retirement planning is confusing the most conservative possible framing with the most realistic one. That is the mother line of this whole story, the moving finish line. If you do not understand the moving finish line, then no number will ever let you feel safe. You will save $500,000 and be told it is thin. You will save $1 million and be told it is risky. You will save $1.5 million and be told it is only the bare minimum. You will save $2 million and someone will still find a way to explain why inflation, healthcare, taxes, sequence risk, longevity, and lifestyle collapse mean you should remain nervous. There is always another reason to be scared when fear is the product being sold. Now, I am not telling you retirement is cheap. I am not telling you healthcare does not matter. I am not telling you inflation is imaginary or that people should retire casually because a spreadsheet made them feel brave one afternoon. I am telling you something much simpler. A retirement plan can be conservative enough to survive contact with reality without being so distorted that it turns a strong position into a story of permanent insufficiency. And that distinction matters enormously, because once a person internalizes the idea that even $1.5 million is basically just scraping by, something dark happens psychologically. He stops seeing retirement as something to model. He starts seeing it as something permanently out of reach. He stops asking, what would work for my life? And starts asking, what impossible number do I still not have? That is how people with perfectly respectable balances remain emotionally poor. I dislike that kind of framing because it does not increase wisdom. It increases learned helplessness. The source material does a very useful job of identifying the trick. What looks like one retirement model is actually two models carelessly blended together. That is the first mechanism. I call it the timeline blur. The timeline blur is what happens when a financial argument quietly mixes an early retirement horizon with a traditional retirement income assumption, then presents the combined result as if it were one coherent baseline. The result sounds sober. In reality, it is structurally muddled. That is exactly the problem here. On one side, the article being discussed wants the emotional drama of an early retirement question. Can you retire in your 50s? Can $1.5 million carry 40 years? Can you really trust that number? That is the seductive setup. On the other side, the article leans on Social Security assumptions that belong much more naturally to a traditional retirement timeline, where benefits begin around full retirement age and the horizon is no longer the same stretched 40-year wilderness being implied earlier. Those are not the same retirement. And if you mix them carelessly, of course the final picture looks tight. I have spent enough time around balance sheets to know that if you blend unlike time horizons, unlike income sources, and unlike drawdown assumptions, you can make almost any situation look worse than it is. That is not prudence. That is design. The first question in retirement planning is always the same. What problem are we actually solving? Not vaguely specifically, are we solving for a retirement at 67 with Social Security already online and a conventional horizon? Fine, that is one problem. Are we solving for a retirement at 55 where the portfolio has to bridge 12 years before Social Security appears? Fine, that is another problem. Those two problems require different arithmetic because they are structurally different. One is a lifetime income problem from the beginning. The other begins as a bridge problem and only later becomes a lifetime income problem. That is a huge distinction. And once you see that distinction, the whole bare minimum framing begins to look much less serious and much more theatrical. The article, As Simple Math, uses a 3% withdrawal rate on a $1.5 million portfolio and gets roughly $45,000. Then it layers on average Social Security at around $24,000 and produces a picture of roughly $69,000 a year. That number is then made to sound like the realistic lived ceiling of a household that has somehow accumulated $1.5 million in investable assets. That is where I begin objecting strongly, because numbers by themselves do not lie, but the way people stage numbers for emotional effect can be profoundly misleading. The first distortion is the 3% withdrawal rate being treated like some obvious neutral baseline. It is not. A 3% rate can be a valid choice for certain people who want extra caution, who have unusual uncertainty, or who simply prefer an enormous margin of safety. Fine. But that does not make it the default reality for every person discussing retirement. Retirement research does not magically collapse to 3% just because a headline wants to sound stern. When I look at retirement, I do not worship one number. I look at conditions. I look at horizon. I look at flexibility. I look at the role of guaranteed income. I look at whether the retiree is actually spending on a fixed inflation, adjusted rail forever, or whether spending behaves more like human spending, rising in some seasons, falling in others, adapting when conditions change. That is how adults think about this, not through one magic percentage. The source material points out that more realistic research often produces a higher starting range than 3%, especially once you distinguish between fixed rigid withdrawals and a more flexible real-world spending pattern. That matters because when the whole thesis of insufficiency begins by using an unusually low assumption, you should immediately ask whether the picture is being shaded darker than necessary before the audience even knows the lights were dimmed. I call this the baseline tilt. The baseline tilt is when a retirement scenario begins with assumptions that are technically possible but systematically more conservative than typical planning reality, creating an emotional impression of fragility before the actual structure of the household has even been examined. Once the baseline is tilted, every later conclusion inherits that pessimism. This is exactly how fear-based retirement content works. It does not always need falsehood. It only needs stacked conservatism. A low withdrawal rate, a low benefit assumption, a long horizon, a vague lifestyle inflation, warning, healthcare fear, sequence risk fear, then one final phrase like checkpoint, not finish line. And suddenly a household in the top tier of liquid wealth is being psychologically recast as barely hanging on. That should bother you because framing is not innocent here. When a person is told that $1.5 million is barely enough, he does not merely learn a number. He learns an emotional posture. He learns that security must remain just out of reach. He learns that his own progress is still not progress. He learns that retirement is not something to evaluate based on his actual circumstances, but something to fear unless some very large institution tells him he may finally stop worrying. That is not financial education. That is dependency training. Now let us talk about the real structure of a household that has accumulated $1.5 million in liquid investable assets by the mid-50s. This matters a great deal because wealth does not arise in a vacuum. A household that gets to $1.5 million outside the primary residence by age 55 is not a normal median household in financial terms. It is rare, it is upper tier, it is, in practical portfolio terms, a liquid millionaire household. That does not mean it is invincible. It does mean it should not be modeled using assumptions more appropriate to households who reach retirement with average savings, average Social Security, and little surplus. That is the second mechanism. I call it the profile mismatch. The profile mismatch is what happens when the planner or writer uses generic averages for a household that is already, by definition, far from average. Once average assumptions are pasted onto an upper-tier profile, the resulting model stops describing a realistic household and starts describing a rhetorical one. That is the problem with the Social Security piece. If a household has really built $1.5 million in liquid wealth by the mid-50s, the most likely story is not that its lifetime earnings profile resembled the average benefit household. Could there be exceptions? Of course. But in broad statistical terms, the households most likely to arrive at that liquid level spent many years in high earnings brackets, not every year, not magically, but enough years for the lifetime earnings picture to be meaningfully stronger than average. That matters because Social Security is not handed out by mood. It is tied to the earnings record. So when the article reaches for an average benefit, it is quietly switching the protagonist. The person who built the portfolio and the person whose earnings support the benefit estimate are no longer clearly the same person. That is how the picture is made to shrink. The source material gives a much more grounded alternative by modeling a conservative dual-income household that averaged $125,000 over a career, split between one earner at $75,000 and another at $50,000. That is not some extravagant fantasy in the context of a household that builds $1.5 million in liquid assets. It is arguably restrained, yet even there the Social Security number comes out meaningfully above the average benefit shorthand used in the fear framing. That changes everything, because once Social Security turns on, the portfolio no longer has to carry the whole life alone. This is where we come to the core conceptual error most people make about retirement. They think retirement is one long problem. It is not. Retirement is a sequence of different problems. That is the third mechanism. I call it the phase shift. The phase shift is the reality that retirement changes character over time. Early retirement before Social Security is one type of cash flow challenge. Retirement after Social Security begins is another. The same dollar in the portfolio does not have the same job in both phases. A plan that ignores the phase change and treats the whole period as one uniform drawdown problem often ends up being much more conservative than necessary. This is the most important structural insight in the file, and I think it is exactly right. If you retire at 55, the first problem is not, how do I make this portfolio single-handedly fund the next 35 or 40 years as if nothing else will ever happen? That is sloppy framing. The first problem is, how do I bridge the 12 years until guaranteed inflation, adjusted income begins? That is a totally different question. A 12-year bridge is not a 40-year lifetime withdrawal regime. It is a finite gap problem. If you solve that gap thoughtfully, then the character of the portfolio at age 67 can be radically different from the fear-based story people tell themselves when they imagine one giant uninterrupted 40-year burn. This is why I think the bridge bucket framing is so useful. I call it the bridge illumination. The bridge illumination is what happens when a retiree stops seeing the pre-Social Security years as an endless abyss and starts seeing them as a finite bridge with a specific cost, a specific duration, and a specific funding role inside the larger portfolio. Once the bridge is illuminated, the whole retirement picture usually becomes less frightening and more manageable. That is exactly the psychological power of the example given. Take $1.5 million at 55. Do not pretend every dollar has one job. Some dollars are there to build and protect a 12-year bridge. Other dollars are there to remain invested and grow for the later phase, when the household S portfolio only needs to cover the gap above Social Security. This is not trick math. This is proper job assignment for capital, and capital behaves much better when you give it a clear job. I have spent my entire life doing that. One pile for insurance float, one pile for acquisitions, one pile for cash needs, one pile for long-duration compounding. The great mistake of amateurs is that they insist all dollars are morally equal and should be analyzed as though each one has the same role. That is nonsense. $1 may be needed next year, another may not be needed for 20 years. They do not deserve the same treatment. And once you stop treating them the same, retirement stops looking like one giant monster and starts looking like a set of solvable sub-problems. That is much healthier. Now let us walk through why this matters so much emotionally. A person told that $1.5 million only produces $45,000 a year from the portfolio, and that average Social Security adds only $24,000 begins to picture a small, brittle life. He hears bare minimum and imagines constant restraint. He imagines that one medical surprise or one inflation burst means disaster. He imagines that early retirement is basically for trust, fun people, not for him. That is the emotional payload of the headline. But if the same person understands that the first 12 years are a bridge, that some part of the capital is still compounding in the background, and that a household capable of building $1.5 million by 55, let's put us not of average Social Security, the whole picture changes. Now we are no longer talking about some strained existence at $69,000. We are talking about a much more realistic spending picture, something more in the range of roughly $90,000 to $110,000 for many such households under disciplined planning assumptions, with room for flexibility and variance. That is not poverty and retirement. That is not bare minimum. That is not the emotional story being sold. That is why I object so strongly to the fear frame. I call it the psychological downsizing effect. The psychological downsizing effect is what happens when a household with a legitimately strong financial position is trained to interpret itself as fragile, because the retirement discussion was built around exaggerated conservatism, blended timelines, and profile mismatch. The person may still make prudent choices, but he does so from fear instead of clarity, and fear tends to push people into lower quality decisions over time. This is not a trivial issue. Fear changes behavior. Fear makes people work longer than necessary. Fear makes people insure, save, underlive, and remain emotionally chained to labor even after they have built something substantial. Fear makes them say no to reasonable travel, reasonable generosity, reasonable transition, reasonable joy, because they have absorbed the idea that the finish line always sits another hill away. I do not like that. I have no objection to caution. I do object to chronic manufactured insufficiency. Now, let us be adults and admit the caveats. Yes, not every household with $1.5 million can spend $100,000 a year without thought. Of course not. Spending depends on where you live, whether you carry debt, whether your housing is owned outright, whether your healthcare costs are unusual, whether your taxes are high, whether you support other family members, whether you are single or a couple, whether you still want to fund large travel plans, and how flexible you are when markets disappoint, all that matters. But none of those caveats justify flattening the picture into bare minimum. That is where language becomes dishonest. There is a huge difference between saying a $1.5 million retirement at 55 requires planning, sequencing, and flexibility, and saying $1.5 million is basically just the minimum. The first sentence is grown-up planning language. The second sentence is fear merchandising. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the bare minimum trick. The bare minimum trick is the rhetorical move by which a strong or even elite financial position is verbally downgraded into something barely sufficient by stacking conservative assumptions until the underlying reality becomes emotionally unrecognizable. It is powerful because it sounds sober. It is misleading because it strips away context. The file S distinction between liquid net worth and total net worth is also extremely important. Here, a household with $1.5 million in investable assets before counting the home is not simply some ordinary family clinging to average retirement. That household has achieved something rare. Rarity is not everything, but it matters if planning conversations cannot even acknowledge the rarity of the achievement. Then the conversation has already tilted toward demoralization. That is one reason I have always disliked media discussions of money that flatten distributions. If a person in the top 2 to 4% of liquid wealth is being made to feel like he is barely starting, what exactly is everyone else supposed to feel? The answer, of course, is behind. That is the business model. And once you see that, much of retirement media becomes easier to decode. The moving finish line is not an accident. It is a genre. It keeps you clicking, doubting, buying advice, seeking reassurance, and remaining permanently receptive to the next warning. Warning is profitable. Relief is not. This is why I want to talk about spending and retirement with more honesty. Retirement spending is not a laboratory creature. It is not one precise inflation, adjusted line drawn out for 40 years, as if human beings become machines once they stop working. Real people spend differently over time. Some years are expensive, some are light. Early retirement may include more travel and experience spending. Later years may include less. Some costs rise, others disappear. People adapt. They pull back when markets are ugly. They spend more when things are strong. They do not behave like robots executing a single doctrine. That is why ultra-rigid withdrawal modeling often creates too much fear. It is not that the math is wrong. It is that the behavior assumption is. I call this the human spending curve. The human spending curve is the reality that retirees do not typically spend in one perfectly rigid inflation adjusted line for decades. Their actual spending often changes by phase, preference, health, and market environment. Models that ignore this can significantly overstate the fragility of an otherwise workable plan. This is especially true when the retiree is capable of some flexibility. And flexibility is one of the most undervalued assets in retirement planning. A person who can cut back modestly in poor markets, delay some travel, postpone some gifting, or temporarily restrain discretionary outlays is not the same as a person whose every dollar is already spoken for. The plan should recognize that. Too often, media framing refuses to recognize it because the point is not to show you how life really works. The point is to show you a headline strong enough to make modest comfort feel dangerous. Now let us talk about the later phase after Social Security starts, because this is where the whole picture often turns from can this work? This is actually far more manageable than the opening headline implied. Once the guaranteed inflation, adjusted Social Security stream enters, the portfolio's job shrinks. That does not mean the portfolio becomes irrelevant. It means the gap the portfolio must cover becomes smaller. And that smaller gap is the right problem to evaluate with withdrawal, rate thinking, not the earlier bridge years. This is one reason I so strongly prefer phase-based retirement design to one. Peace fear narratives. The moment you respect the phase change, the portfolio often stops looking like a fragile pile of money and starts looking like a system. One bucket protects the bridge. One bucket compounds quietly. Guaranteed income eventually arrives. The portfolio then supports the gap rather than the whole structure. That is how a real plan works. It does not stare at one number and panic. It assigns jobs and sequences risk. I call this the job assignment principle. The job assignment principle is the discipline of giving different parts of a portfolio different roles based on time horizon and cash flow need, rather than forcing the entire retirement balance to solve every future year in exactly the same way. Once capital is assigned properly, the retiree gains both clarity and resilience. That is what the file does correctly, and it is why the end conclusion is so different from the article as emotional opening. A carefully built $1.5 million liquid portfolio by the mid-50s is not some pathetic near failure. It can be a very strong base for an early retirement, especially for a disciplined dual-income household with realistic Social Security later and a willingness to think in phases instead of headlines. That does not mean everyone should retire at 55 with that number. It does mean the bare minimum story is too coarse, too conservative, and too rhetorically loaded to deserve the authority it is usually given. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it the checkpoint reversal. The checkpoint reversal is what happens when a number portrayed as merely an anxious checkpoint turns out, under realistic phase-based analysis, to be much closer to a viable destination for the right household than the fear framing suggested. The reversal is important because it restores proportion. It puts the number back into a human context instead of a panic context. I want to say something here that I think retirees and retirees desperately need to hear. You do not need to choose between fantasy and dread. Those are not the only options. You do not need to pretend retirement is effortless. You do not need to pretend $1.5 million solves every problem. You do not need to pretend healthcare is trivial. You do not need to pretend inflation does not matter. But you also do not need to accept a media script that turns every strong milestone into evidence that you are still somehow failing. That script is corrosive over time. It teaches people that no amount is enough, no planning is sufficient, and no progress deserves calm. I think that is a terrible way to relate to money, especially at the threshold of retirement, where the whole point of the exercise is not merely to survive, but to finally experience a different relationship with time. Time is the real asset retirement is buying, not just consumption. Time with more ownership over your day. Time to travel, time to rest, time to read, time to care for family, time to walk slowly, time to be a human being again instead of a schedule carrying a job title. If every retirement conversation is framed so conservatively that people never feel permitted to trust their own numbers, then the retirement system is no longer helping people manage risk. It is helping them remain obedient to work. I do not say that lightly. I say it because fear has a function. Fear keeps people from leaving the machine. That does not mean all caution is propaganda, but it does mean we should be very alert to framing that always, somehow, ends with the listener feeling smaller, later, and less prepared than he objectively is. Now let me be even more practical. If you are sitting somewhere near this number and wondering what to do, I would ask you 6 real questions. Not in panic and sequence. What age are you actually targeting? What is your bridge period before guaranteed income starts? What kind of Social Security profile do you really have based on your actual earnings? Not some article as average stand. In how much of your spending is flexible? What role does your house play in the plan? And how should the portfolio be divided by job rather than analyzed as one undifferentiated lump? Those questions are worth more than 1,000 headlines, because headlines are built to pull emotion, questions are built to reveal structure. I have always trusted structure more. If the bridge is short enough, the spending flexible enough, the guaranteed income strong enough, and the capital assigned properly, then what looked frightening in one giant blended model can start looking very workable. That is not cheating. That is thinking, and thinking is still the rarest commodity in most retirement conversations. So here's where I come out. $1.5 million is not a magic number. That part is true. No number is magic. But it is also not some pathetic bare minimum by default. That is false. It is a large number, a rare number, a powerful number in the right household, and in a realistic early retirement framework, especially for a couple with real earning history and later Social Security. It can support a much fuller and more dignified life than fear. Base framing would ever admit. That is the real lesson. Not that every article is wrong, but that every scary number story has to be interrogated for the assumptions hiding under it. Because assumptions are where retirement narratives win or lose their honesty. A low withdrawal rate assumption, a low benefit assumption, a blended horizon, a fully rigid spending pattern, an average profile pasted onto an uncommon household. Stack enough of those together, and you can make almost anyone feel poor. Refuse to stack them carelessly, and suddenly retirement looks less like a constantly receding finish line and more like what it should have been all along. A problem to solve, not a sentence to fear.